Good day and welcome. My name is Dr. Alex Lenferna, and today I have the pleasure and the privilege of presenting to you a core lecture on the harsh realities of climate change, but also looking at how responding to climate change represents not only the greatest challenge, arguably, of our generation, but also one of the greatest opportunities to transform our societies for the better. And this is part of the Access Habitable Planet workshop. Before diving into the substance of the lecture, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself. So about 10 years ago, I was taking the Habitable Planet workshop in one of the in-person workshops, and that was a very transformative experience for me, helping me engage the science and the interdisciplinary nature of climate change. And for over a decade, I've been doing research along similar lines, looking at various different disciplines around climate change. It's one of the most interdisciplinary and complex problems we face that relates to social sciences and natural sciences and politics and psychology are all important in helping us understand climate change and also how to respond to it. And for over a decade now, I've been doing research on climate change based predominantly out of a philosophy department. So I look at questions of justice and fairness and how we respond to climate change. Thinking about how we share the burdens of benefits in ways that are fair and equitable. But I do it from a very interdisciplinary perspective, where I incorporate the economics, the science, the politics, and thinking about how do we ensure that we respond in ways that are fair. Right? So that's my work in terms of research, and I've done a lot of teaching, and I did my PhD on that front. But I also do a lot of advocacy work. So I currently working with an organization called 350 Africa, and we are an organization that builds political will to try and push for policy responses to climate change, so that we are acting up to the scale of the problem that we face, and that we're moving towards solutions like renewable energy. And I'm going to incorporate both the research and the advocacy side into this talk today as we think about the challenges that climate change brings and how do we muster the appropriate response to address it. Okay. So let's dive in by looking firstly at the basic science, and then we're going to dive more into the challenges we face and how we respond to it. So, starting off, hopefully by this point in the course, everybody is aware of the greenhouse gas effect, right? Basically, our Earth's atmosphere is warmed depending on how much greenhouse gases there are within it, right? So we have this natural greenhouse gas effect that keeps our atmosphere warm as a result of greenhouse gases. Humans, however, are enhancing this greenhouse gas effect by adding in more greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous dioxide, and through burning fossil fuels like oil, coal, and gas, and deforestation and soil degradation. Deforestation and soil degradation, they both contain a lot of carbon and so on. And so when you deforest or you break down soils, they also release carbon dioxide. And when you burn fossil fuels, they also release these greenhouse gas emissions. And so through human activities, we have been enhancing this greenhouse gas effect and changing the nature of our Earth's atmosphere and the warming within it. Now, let's look a little bit back to the past, because to a significant extent, climate change is a natural phenomenon. Right? So looking at this graph up here, we're looking millions of years before the present. And this is looking at sort of the average surface temperature. And this is something that's we're able to tell through looking at ice cores, through looking at tree rings, through looking through all sorts of mechanisms of being able to study the climate of the past. Right? And what we see is that the Earth's average surface temperature has changed consistently throughout the past. Right? So the climate is always changing. Right? However, what's important is to think about the nature of that changing climate, and especially to think about the climate that we as humans have evolved into. So around here, Homo sapiens appear on the Earth's planet, right? About 400,000 years ago, right? So in terms of our evolution and our emergence on the planet. And the important thing is, when we zoom into this, we realize that humans have evolved in a relatively stable climate. So here the red line represents carbon dioxide, which is the predominant greenhouse gas, right? It's the major one that really determines how much the Earth's surface temperature will warm or cool, depending on how much we put in, right? And the blue line is here temperature, and first thing hopefully you'll notice is just how closely correlated the temperature and the carbon dioxide emissions are. It's because the carbon dioxide emissions are very much a driver of the temperature of the Earth because of that greenhouse gas effect that we talked about. The second thing you'll hopefully notice is that the carbon dioxide emissions have stayed very much within this sort of band here between about 200 parts per million and 300 parts per million. Right? And a part per million is basically the measurement of how much carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere. Right? It's how much carbon dioxide we have per parts of million in the atmosphere of other gases. Right? And what's important about this is that because we've evolved in this particular band, right, humans have become adapted to this particular climate. And so the scientists who have done studies around climate change have said that because we've evolved within this particular sort of band of climatic stability, right, if we push beyond it, we start to move into dangerous and unfamiliar climate zones. So there was a study done in 2008 by NASA scientists, James Hansen and others, looking at basically where we would start to see dangerous climate change. And they suggested that if we pushed past about 350 parts per million, this mark here, that we would start to move into dangerous and unfamiliar climatic territory, and therefore we should do our best to keep the climate from pushing past that particular point. And back when they did the study, we hadn't yet pushed past that point. However, since then, we have added more and more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere to the point where we're actually about 400 parts per million. And so according to the scientists' study, we've already breached to a significant extent what they considered to be the safe climatic zone in which humans had evolved. Right? And 350.org is actually the name of the organization that I work for. We developed our name out of those studies which said that this was the safe climatic point that we should be aiming for. Right? So that's one problem in terms of the climatic changes that we are facing, is that we as humans evolved in this relatively stable band of climate, right? And we've pushed beyond that, beyond what we've seen in the past 400,000 years. So it's a very significant geological change, which normally takes place over many millennia, has taken place in just a few hundred years, right? And so that's the second thing that is dangerous about it, is the speed at which it has occurred. Because as we said, the climate has always changed in the past, but what is different now and what is very scary for us is the speed at which the climate is changing. And the climate is changing much faster than any other natural analog, even during some of the most dramatic moments in the past. So, for instance, the end of the Permian age, when most of life went extinct. The carbon dioxide grew at about 1/10 of the current pace we're seeing now, right? So even during moments of mass extinction, right, the carbon dioxide changed slower than what we're seeing now. And so this is a very dangerous shift. And already studies are showing that many animals are struggling to adapt fast enough to climate change. And because we are dependent on the ecosystems as well, so if these ecosystems and these animals can't adapt fast enough, that has these deleterious impacts on us too. And so the big challenge for us, given that we've already perturbed and changed the climate so much, is can we slow down the rate of greenhouse gas emissions and try and return the climate to a more stable point? And this in many ways is one of our greatest challenges. And the reason why carbon dioxide really started to spike in this particular point here is because this is the moment of the Industrial Revolution, really, where humans learned to be able to tap coal, oil, and gas and burn them to release energy. But at the same time as we were releasing energy, when we burn fossil fuels, we also release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And so with that explosion in the Industrial Revolution in terms of our ability to harness energy, we've also fundamentally changed the Earth's atmosphere. Now, many people, when they think about climate change, they think about the polar bear, they think about ecosystems and so on, and I think that's really important, that we are impacting a lot of the Earth's natural ecosystems. But also, when we think about climate change, it is very fundamentally a problem of human development. It is a human problem. And increasingly, we are recognizing that the more we change the climate, the more we threaten ourselves as humanity. And so this is from the UN Human Development Report back in 2007. And they said that climate change is the defining human development challenge of the 21st century. And that failure to respond to that challenge will stall and then reverse progress built up over generations, not just in cutting extreme poverty, but in health, nutrition, education, and other areas. And in South Africa, we're beginning to see those effects already. For instance, across the Eastern Cape, and the Western Cape, and throughout the Peru, we've seen crippling droughts over the last years, which have threatened people's food security, their access to water. It has threatened agriculture, and it's threatened our ability for our cities and towns to function properly. Walter Sisulu University in Fort Hare in August of 2019 had to close down due to the lack of access to water. In 2019, KwaZulu-Natal saw devastating floods which displaced many people and killed numerous others as well. In Mozambique, in 2019, we also saw two major cyclones, both of which broke significant records and devastated entire cities, displacing millions. And so we're already starting to see that climate change is here with us. Human-induced climate change is making it worse, right? And that it is incredibly dangerous already, and that it really threatens humanity and our ability to develop and to be prosperous, right? And to address issues like poverty and health. Right? So looking at just the climate change we've locked in right now, studies show that climate change has cost South Africa 10 to 20% of our GDP already. So humans have changed the climate so much that it's made us 10 to 20% poorer here in South Africa. And at the same time, it has also increased global economic inequality. Right? And so climate change is really having some pretty deleterious effects. And if we do not work to address climate change at a faster rate, the future climatic impact could wreak significant and expensive impacts across Africa, especially across Africa. And the reason why Africa is so particularly vulnerable in this space is because of our geographical location. So Africa warms at twice the global average. So if let's say the Earth warms 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which it has now, right, Africa on average would warm about 2 degrees Celsius below, compared to its pre-industrial average levels. And so because of our geographic location, because we're on land, because of where we are situated, we're actually particularly vulnerable to climate change here in Africa, right? And that's why African nations in the big UN spaces have really advocated for strong action on climate change historically, recognizing their own particular vulnerability to the issue. Right? So speaking of UN spaces, right, so the world has recognized that climate change is such a grave threat. And so since the 1990s, the world has been coming together under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is this big UN body that attempts to bring all the world's nations together to determine how we respond to climate change. And they're tasked with trying to prevent dangerous interference in the Earth's climatic system, right? Which to a certain extent we've seen they've already failed to do, seeing as we've already locked in some harmful climate change. But in 2015, at their 21st meeting, they meet every year for their big main meetings. At their 21st main meeting in Paris, they agreed to what is now referred to as the Paris Climate Agreement. Right? And there they decided that the world would aim to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and also pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're already at 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and we're starting to see pretty detrimental impacts. Right? So, to a certain extent, if we were just thinking about maintaining a stable climate, we would just stop it there and say, no, we can't go any further. But the challenge we face is that humanity is locked in a lot of fossil fuel-intensive infrastructure like coal power plants, cars, and oil and gas facilities, which emit a significant amount. And so there is this trade-off or this challenge between how do we wind down that sort of infrastructure in order to slow down climate change, while also allowing us time to make the shift necessary to things like renewable energy. And the sort of the political trade-offs that went to the Paris Agreement suggested that we would be aiming for well below 2 and trying harder to move towards 1.5. Now that 1.5 degrees Celsius target became very, very important, especially for African nations, least developed countries, and small island states who are all very vulnerable to climate change. Small island states, particularly because one of the major impacts of climate change is sea level rise. As the oceans warm, it basically expands the ocean so that they rise more. But it also melts glaciers, which then lead to increased sea level rise. Right? And so for small island states who are very exposed to sea level rise, this was a very important mark, saying we don't want just well below 2 degrees Celsius. We want urgent, ambitious action to keep climate change to at least 1.5. And they came up with the slogan of 1.5 to stay alive. And they worked in coalition with the group of African states and the world's least developed countries, which is about 47 of the countries that are least developed, but are also very vulnerable to climate change. And during the time of much of this advocacy, when we were pushing for 1.5 degrees Celsius, we had prominent figures like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said that if we aim for 2 degrees instead of 1.5, that goal would be to condemn Africa to incineration. So a little bit of hyperbole there, but he was trying to bring home the point of how vulnerable Africa is to climate impacts and our need to act much more ambitiously. Professor Rob Jackson here is a scientist, and he tells us, 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius may not sound like much. Right? On your average day, the temperature might fluctuate quite a number of degrees Celsius, right? But I think the way to think about this is, let's say your body temperature. If your body shifts a few degrees Celsius, it actually makes a major difference. It can mean the difference between life and death in terms of how warm your body is. And similarly, when it comes to the Earth's climate, while half a degree may not sound like much, in reality, it makes a real world of difference in terms of the climate impact that we would feel. And that difference between half a degree Celsius has been fleshed out significantly through scientific work done subsequent to the Paris Climate Agreement. So, at the Paris Climate Agreement, they basically decided that we needed to study the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius more. And the politicians at the UN space, they basically delegated the task of studying this to this almost scientific body around climate change called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is a really austere scientific body made up of thousands of scientists across the world who volunteer to review all the science around climate change and create these summary reports of the state of climate science as we know it. And they were tasked with studying the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees coming out of that Paris Climate Agreement space. And then in 2018, in October 2018, they came up with a special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius. And a big part of what they were looking at is, if we hit 1.5, what does the world look like, versus if we hit 2 degrees Celsius, what does the world look like? And their results show quite convincingly that 1.5 degrees Celsius is a world that is much preferable to 2 degrees Celsius. And this is on many measures. If we keep to 1.5, we will decrease the amount of debilitating heat waves that we will face, which cause death, which prevent us from being able to work, which cause significant health issues. Additionally, we will increase the amount of access to fresh water that we face. Already at 1.5, we will have decreased access to fresh water because climate change increases the amount of droughts that we have, and also, ironically, increases the amount of flooding. And that's because a warmer atmosphere is able to hold more moisture in the atmosphere. So that means it can hold more, which means it rains less often because it's holding more water. But when it rains much harder. And so we both have an increase in droughts, generally speaking, followed by an increase in flooding. So it's a more extreme precipitation regime that we're moving into. And so even at 1.5, we'll see less access to fresh water. And we're already seeing major challenges in access to fresh water at 1 degree Celsius. But if we push to 2 degrees Celsius, then we see significant decreases. And if we allow warming to go beyond 2 degrees Celsius, then access to fresh water becomes just an incredibly difficult challenge, although it already is. And so it's just a question of how bad we allow it to get to a significant extent. Similarly, when it comes to heavy rainfall, we see increased heavy rainfall under 2 degrees Celsius regime compared to 1.5. When it comes to crop yields, 2 degrees Celsius will really impact crop yields quite a lot more than 1.5, and so we face significant food security issues under this 2 degrees Celsius future if we allow us to get there or beyond it. Similarly, when it comes to sea level rise, we see increased sea level rise under 2 degrees Celsius. And also when it comes to coral bleaching, coral reefs are some of the most sensitive ecosystems to climatic impacts. And so what happens is as the water warms, the relationship between corals, both an algae and a sort of little animal, they expel their algae when it gets too hot, and that leads to coral bleaching. And that causes corals to die. And so as we warm the oceans, corals are really struggling to keep up. So even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we'll lose much of the coral cover of the Earth. But if we allow warming to go to 2 degrees Celsius, scientists tell us that we may lose almost all of the world's tropical coral reefs. And so this is a potentially devastating element because many countries rely on coral reefs for their fisheries, right? And so fisheries will be devastated. But also coral reefs play a very important role in protecting countries like my home country of Mauritius, where my family comes from. Coral reefs play a really important role in protecting the islands from sea level rise and from stormwater surges coming in from extreme weather events. So as corals die, this really important layer of protection also dies, right? And so it impacts tourism, it impacts fisheries, and it impacts the ability for coastlines to protect against extreme weather events, which will become more devastating as the climate changes. And so corals are really important, and they're very threatened under our current climate regime. Okay. So this is the real importance of 1.5 versus 2 degrees Celsius. And Africa, as a group, has really been advocating strongly for 1.5, along with the world's developing and least developed countries, recognizing how important it is for us to protect ourselves against climatic change. And now I'm going to show you a spiral graph of world's temperature changes here. Okay, and so what I'm showing you right now is basically a representation of how the Earth's temperature has changed over time. And it's basically to show you how close we are coming to this 1.5 degrees Celsius target, which I told you was so vitally important. So starting here at 1850, it's going to start again now, and then we can watch as the Earth's temperature, global temperature changes. Okay, we'll get going now. As we see in the beginning, it's starting to change slowly as the Industrial Revolution starts to take off. But as we come closer to the present, we emit more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and so the rate of change begins to speed up. Right? As we see, as we move right into the present, that is spiraling dangerously close to that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And so we face a major challenge in terms of keeping climate change from moving to that point. Right? Now, when we think about who has contributed the most to those greenhouse gas emissions that have spiraled us to that point of getting so close to 1.5 degrees Celsius, I think it's really important for us to recognize that not all countries are equal in their contribution to this problem. The world's major emitters are countries like the United States, like China, like Russia, Germany, United Kingdom, Japan, India, France, Canada, Poland, the EU, and Australia. These are the major emitters that have contributed the most. Right? South Africa is also in there. We're the world's 13th biggest emitting country. And so it's mostly a group of about 20 countries that have contributed the most to this problem. And the biggest by far is America, who's the largest historical emitter and contributed the most to the problem. Right? And so when we think about questions of responsibility for climate change, it's arguably these major countries that have a responsibility not only to act to reduce their emissions, but also to act to help those that are negatively impacted because of the emissions they've created. Right? There's a sense of moral responsibility that comes from having caused the problem, where you should help those that are negatively impacted by it. And that's one of the basic moral principles underlying climate justice, is the polluter pays principle, that those who pollute should pay to deal with the harm that they have created. Right? And what furthers the injustice of this particular climate problem is what is referred to sometimes as the climate paradox. That's where least developed countries, so the countries that are least developed, about 47 of them, they account for less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So they have done the least to cause the problem of climate change between them. But they're also the most vulnerable to this problem. They suffer more than 34% of the world's deaths linked to climate change, right? And so at the heart of climate change, globally speaking, is this deep injustice where those that have contributed the most, right, are not suffering as much as those who contributed the least. And this is the climate paradox at its heart, right? And it's not just an injustice at the global level, but it is also within countries that we see that, and with across individuals that we see there's an inequality in terms of who contributes and who's impacted, right? So across the world, when we think about consumption and those who are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions through their consumption, it is the richest in the world that are most responsible here. So this particular graph is from an Oxfam study, and it shows us that the richest 10% of the world is responsible for 49% of carbon dioxide emissions, right? And so really it is the richest that are consuming the most and that are causing the problem most significantly, right? Often when discussions of climate change come up, right, they tell us that population control is a very important element because increased population causes more greenhouse gas emissions. And while to a certain extent that's true, that the fewer people we have, the less emissions we will create. What's really important to keep in mind when discussing population is it's often the richest percent of the population that contribute most to the problem. And so when we think about blame in terms of population, arguably blaming it on the poorest, where population growth is most significant, is maybe pointing the finger in the wrong place, which is not to say that dealing with population is not an important element, because indeed empowering women, providing access to education for girls is one of the most important elements, not only for creating more just society, but also for helping us engage with population issues and ensure a slowing of carbon dioxide emissions going forward. But at the same time, we should be careful about pointing the finger at the poor when it is in fact the richest in our society that are contributing the most to greenhouse gas emissions. And the same holds for the top 50% of the world's population, not just the richest 10%, but those who are above the poverty, sort of the bottom 50% poverty level, are contributing most to this problem. And so here's another question of inequality and justice that is at the heart of our climate change problem. Yeah. So looking forward, when we think about how important this 1.5 degrees Celsius target is, that same Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that looked on what are the difference between the 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius impacts, also tried to tell us what would be needed to be done to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? And so this is a graph from their report. And what we're looking at here in the red line is our historical CO2 emissions, our carbon dioxide emissions. And we see is that the rate of CO2 emissions has gone up and up and up over the last decades, and it started before then, but over the last century, it's gone up really significantly, right? And now the black line ahead of us there is the line that tells us if we continue as usual where we will go, and we would be aiming for a world much warmer than 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? And be entering a much more dangerous climate zone to 4 degrees Celsius, which studies tell us is really incompatible with human civilization as we know it. That's the world of a conservative organization like the World Bank, right? So in order to keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to take this rate of CO2 emissions and bend it really rapidly over the next few decades. By 2030, they suggest we need to almost half our greenhouse gas emissions globally. And then by about 2050, we need to reach a point of what they call net zero, where we are emitting as much carbon dioxide as we are removing from the atmosphere, right? And so this is a major transformative challenge that we face in order to address climate change. Really, we have to fundamentally transform our societies, which are so reliant on fossil fuels, which create greenhouse gases. And over the space of a few short decades, we have to fundamentally shift if we are to keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so this is a tweet from a futurist called Alex he says that if people actually understood the speed with which humanity's windows of opportunity are closing when it comes to climate change, that the young would be rioting in the streets. And he wrote this tweet a few years ago before, really, the young were rioting in the streets. But what we see is that young people are taking to the streets across the world. We're seeing young people and people more generally really starting to get into the streets and demand change on climate change, that we need to take action. We need to rapidly shift our society, right? And so young people, for instance, are part of this movement that's called the Fridays for Future movement, where on Fridays they'll often strike from school and go demand action from their politicians. And there's these growing groups of Extinction Rebellion where they go out to the street and they'll commit non-violent civil disobedience in order to pressure politicians to take action, right? And a lot of the reason why the need for this political activism emerges is because when we think about the major causes of climate change, it comes from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. Right? And these are some of the richest companies on Earth. In fact, the fossil fuel industry is arguably the richest, most powerful industry in the history of Earth. And they have been resisting action on climate change. Right? They have a lot of power, they have a lot of wealth, and so they're able to influence politicians. And in places like America, for instance, they've been able to spread misinformation about climate change, and they've been able to buy out politicians. They've been able to buy out the entire Republican Party almost, to the point where the Republican Party denies climate change and doesn't want to act on it. Right? And this is how successful the fossil fuel industry has been in preventing progress on climate change. Right? And so in response, what we're starting to see is the growth of these movements aimed at tackling climate change, aimed at building the political needed to shift this political block on climate change and ensure robust action in the short window of time we have left to address it. Right? And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change really tells us that we need this major transformative action. Right? So it says to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target will require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban infrastructure, including our transport and our buildings and our industrial systems. And they say that these transitions are not unprecedented in terms of scale, or are unprecedented in terms of scale, but not necessarily in terms of speed. But they do imply deep reductions in all sectors. And so really this is a transformation across all sectors of the society. It's a major transformation. And in some ways that's a scary prospect, but in other ways it is a potential for a transformative endeavor which moves us to a more prosperous society. We're at a point now where renewable energy is cheaper than other fossil fuel alternatives, right? And so we can actually provide more affordable and cleaner energy through solar and wind than relying on our current polluting fossil fuel infrastructure, which causes air and water pollution and harms communities. Right? So this is a very exciting element. And at the same time, renewable energy can create more job creation than the fossil fuel alternative. So this is another element where there is a really positive point about making this transformation. It's not just about climate change, although of course climate change is a major reason why we should be making this change. Additionally, a lot of the time people will tell us that moving away from fossil fuels will threaten development. Right? But when we look at the studies and the surveys of the scientific evidence, it actually shows that by moving to a pathway in alignment with 1.5 degrees Celsius, we can actually increase our ability to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this is a relatively complicated looking graph here, but it comes from that IPCC report that I've been telling you about, that 1.5 degrees Celsius report. And what I want you to take away from this is that each one of these blocks here on the left is a Sustainable Development Goal, right? It's our ability to meet development goals in a way that is sustainable. Right? So things like ending poverty, ending hunger, ensuring good health and well-being, bringing about quality education, gender inequality, clean water and sanitation, providing affordable and clean energy. Right? These are the sorts of things the Sustainable Development Goals are about. Right? It's about making a better world for us and for our environment and for future generations. And what I want to show you about this graph is the browns here are where there are trade-offs. Right? It basically says where if we go to 1.5 degrees Celsius, there are some trade-offs that we will need to make. Right? And we see that there's a little bit of brown. Right? And so there are ways in which, in order to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, there will be some sacrifices that we'll have to make. But the positive side of this is the blue, which is synergies. It tells us where by meeting 1.5 we can enhance meeting our sustainable development goals. And the simple thing to take away from this graph is there is a lot more blue than there is brown, which means that meeting 1.5 degrees Celsius is actually one of the greatest opportunities that we have to ensure that we meet our sustainable development goals. So not only is action on climate change potentially transformative in terms of our ability to move to a more affordable, reliable, renewable energy system, which provides more jobs and can potentially be more equitable through giving us distributed energy systems, right, which can provide power to many more than fossil fuels can. But it is also potentially transformative in its ability to allow us to meet these sustainable development goals. So while the transformation that we need to make on climate change is really significant and rapid and transformative, the potential to create a better world through doing so is quite immense. And this rather complicated graph in a way just represents that through doing this we can ensure a world that is more sustainable, but is also more developed, and ensures we have less poverty, less inequality, better access to water and electricity and to healthcare. Right? And so this is really an exciting moment for us as humanity, where we stand potentially on the brink of either devastating climate change or on the brink of really transformative potential to create a better world. And so for us, as the younger generation coming to this world, and for those that are still around in the older generation, to truly embrace this opportunity for change is an incredible responsibility, but it's also an incredible opportunity. Right. So here, I'll draw on Tata Madiba, Nelson Mandela. And this is the speech that he gave at a conference that was about, it was a big concert actually, that was about ending poverty. But because poverty is so tightly linked to climate change being one of the biggest threats to poverty alleviation, I thought it would be an appropriate quote here too. Tata Madiba says, "Sometimes it falls upon a generation to be great. You can be that great generation as the greatness blossoms. Of course the task will not be easy, but not to do this would be a crime against humanity, against which I ask all humanity now to rise up." Just to rise up for climate justice in this context, so just to rise up to ensure we have a better future. And I thought I would just end by talking a little bit about the organization that I work with called 350africa.org. And basically we're an organization that is across the world, 350.org, and we're the African branch of this. And this is a global movement of civil society, of people that are getting engaged in acting on climate change and are getting engaged, calling for leaders to act, pressuring politicians to put in place the right policy, and really building the political will to help us address the crisis that we face as humanity when it comes to climate change. So if you're interested in getting involved, you're welcome to sign up for our mailing list to get stuck in, right? Because climate change truly is one of the most momentous challenges of our generation, but it is also one of our greatest opportunities. And so, thank you very much for your time. I hope this lecture has been informative in terms of helping us think through the challenges that climate change has for us, but also in terms of the opportunities. I think as people taking the Have a Planet workshop, this presents an opportunity for you to climate change presents an opportunity to learn more, to get engaged, because the challenge of this scope requires people from all across the different spectrums. So psychologists play an important role in helping us understand how humans respond to this issue and how we can address it right. Politicians play an important role in helping us craft responses, political science in helping us understand how we can make it happen. The natural scientists will play an amazingly important role in helping us understand how the climate will change and how we can respond to it. And perhaps, people like myself, philosophers, can help us understand questions of justice and fairness and how we respond to this changing world. And really, I think the point is that we need everybody engaging with this issue of climate change if we're going to respond to such a complex and large-scale challenge that we're facing. So I hope you all get deeply involved, and I hope to see you working on climate change in the future. Thank you for your time.